Okay, so thanks very much for joining us for the final panel of today. And so I think it's been just an amazing lineup so far in terms of the diversity of voices we've heard about the history of Watergate. So this last panel is talking about the hidden motives of James McCord, which may not be immediately obvious from Ray's presentation, but hopefully in my own presentation we'll draw out the links between the Moorer-Radford affair and some of James McCord's own ideology a bit later on in the panel. And we'll also hear from Scott Camil later on, of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who was targeted by McCord around the time of Watergate. So in our first presentation, I'd like to present Ray Locker, who's a longtime journalist and author in Washington. Before he turned to writing full-time, he was the Washington Enterprise editor at USA Today, where he supervised coverage of the White House military, money in politics and healthcare. And his first book, Nixon's Gamble, was the result of years of interest in Nixon and current events. And Haig's Coup, which followed, was a follow-up volume which digs more deeply into how Alexander Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, forced Nixon from office. So how the panel is going to run is we're going to hear from Ray for 20 minutes in the first presentation. Then I'm going to come and do my own presentation on McCord's final PowerPoint to his family about the role of Vietnam Veterans Against the War in his motivation for Watergate. And then Scott Camil will kind of give a rebuttal or kind of add to McCord's view of what VVAW were up to at that time in a discussion with me after that. And then at the end of the panel, Ray will come back for questions along with Scott and myself. So yeah, really looking forward to this. So let's get started. I'm going to hand over to Ray and I'll be back later.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Shane, for having me here. This is a fascinating group of panels. I mean, and an awesome topic on the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. I'm going to start with set a scene here. It's June 25th, 1975. We're in a Coast Guard station in San Clemente, California, where a haggard, bitter, and combative Richard Nixon is testifying before a federal grand jury that's investigating whether or not his former FBI director, L. Patrick Gray, had committed perjury. This testimony was classified until 2011, and it's classic Nixon. He defends himself, lashes out at his critics, and tries to justify his actions. And near the end of this testimony, he goes into an explanation of kind of the whole raison d'etre of the Nixon administration. And he says, "You and the prosecutors can kick the hell out of us for wiretapping and for the plumbers and the rest. But because of secrecy, we have changed the world." This secrecy, he said, shortened the Vietnam War. The secret Cambodian bombing saved at least 10,000 lives. They enabled him to reach an arms control deal with the Soviets. And if he had to negotiate in public, he said, quote, "With no security whatever, then the United States is finished as a great power. Maybe a lot of people don't care, but I care a great deal. I think all of you care a great deal." That is what Yeoman Radford is about. And I would strongly urge the special prosecutor, don't open that can of worms, because there is even more. Well, he was right. There was a lot more. Now, who was Yeoman Radford? Well, he was a man named Charles Radford, 27 years old, enlisted man in the Navy, and he worked in what was called the liaison office in the National Security Council for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he basically would collect information, he would run copies, he was basically a gopher. He would take notes, do whatever his bosses needed him to do. His first boss was an admiral named Rembrandt Robinson, and then later in 1971, succeeded by another admiral named Robert Wellender. And they would dispatch him on a variety of tasks. And after I wrote my two books, I met a former Nixon aide named Les Janka, who told me when he worked at the White House, he would always see Radford working at the copying machine, which was quite ominous, as we'll see right now. So we go to December 1971. There's a war between India and Pakistan. It had to do with a variety of crises related to the birth of the nation we now call Bangladesh, which was then known as East Pakistan. Totally, that was a Muslim country, as was West Pakistan, but a totally different ethnic group, mostly Bengalis as opposed to people from the West. And they wanted to have their own country, created a huge refugee crisis, people spilling into India. And there was a great amount of tension between the two countries. Pakistan started a war, and the United States and India fought back. The United States was ostensibly neutral during all this, but Nixon, for reasons of his own, was tilting toward Pakistan. And on December 14th, 1971, there was an influential column by columnist Jack Anderson that appeared in the Post and other Anderson clients. It said, "A dangerous confrontation is developing between Soviet and American naval forces in the Bay of Bengal. President Nixon has ordered a naval task force into those troubled waters as a restraint upon India." And this column contained a whole trove of information that was secret and was really only included in documents seen by the NSC and members of this liaison office. And it was a bombshell. Immediately, Rear Admiral Robert Welander, who was Radford's boss, suspected something was amiss. He read the columns. He was shocked. There were quotes in there verbatim from NSC meetings with Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor. He knew somebody had leaked the documents. And on the way to work that morning, he asked Radford if Radford had leaked it. Radford said no. Welander knew it wasn't going to stop there, so he asked Alexander Haig, an Army brigadier general who was Kissinger's deputy, to help investigate what he believed was a leak. Haig took that information to John Ehrlichman, who was one of Nixon's closest aides, who was also the nominal head of what was called the Special Investigations Unit, also known as the Plumbers, and said, "We need to investigate this." Ehrlichman assigned the task of investigating the leak to one of the main plumbers, a former NSC aide, a New York lawyer named David Young, who had once worked for Kissinger. And Young teamed up with a Pentagon investigator named Donald Stewart, who was a former FBI agent. They brought in a polygraph expert, and they started interviewing various people, including Radford. Radford had no problem going to polygraph because he didn't leak the documents. And so while he's on the box, Radford gets asked a variety of questions he has no problem answering. And then the polygraph questioner asked whether Radford had given documents to anybody who was uncleared. And Radford had to pause because he knew that he had. And he got visibly upset and started to cry and asked that if he would be allowed to call his boss, Admiral Welander, which he did. And Welander figured, well, sure, you can go ahead and answer the questions. And Radford answered the questions. And he said, yes, I've been taking documents from the NSC and giving them to my bosses at the Pentagon. And that became what people now call the Moorer-Radford spy ring. Radford being Charles Radford, the yeoman, Moorer being Admiral Thomas Moorer, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Young and Ehrlichman continued on their investigation for about a week, and they assembled a variety of information that they wanted to give to the president. And they finally had their chance to do that on December 21st, 1971. They had to wait until Nixon came back from Bermuda, where he was having a meeting with British Prime Minister Edward Heath. Nixon comes back into the Oval Office. Ehrlichman lays out the whole thing, and Nixon erupts, "Jesus Christ." And he's like, what happened, you know? Over the course of the next few days, Nixon finds out more and more what happened. And he realizes that there's really nothing he can do about it. Because at the time of this leak, he was negotiating with the Soviet Union on an arms control deal, trying to open diplomatic relations with China, going through secret talks to end the Vietnam War. All those depended on the image that he had a strong relationship with the US military. If any American adversary thought that Nixon and the Pentagon were split, they might negotiate in a totally different fashion. knowing that Nixon might not be able to back up what he wanted to say. And Nixon knew that immediately. To Pentagon, he told a group of his top advisors, including Attorney General John Mitchell, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, the Pentagon, he said, cannot become our enemy. We cannot have it. And also, we can't have this goddamn security problem. So eventually, he orders a stop to the investigation by the White House because he really doesn't want to know more than he already knows. But Young and Ehrlichman weren't done. They brought in Welander for an interview at the White House. They presented him with a confession that he refused to sign. But during the interview, he admitted that he routinely got information from Alexander Haig, Kissinger's deputy, that was then passed along to the Pentagon. And that was exactly what Kissinger and Nixon did not want to happen. They wanted to keep all of this secret from the military, and Haig was breaking secrecy. And actually, when Nixon first learned about this, he wanted to know if Haig was involved and was assured that he wasn't, which was incorrect. He was deeply involved. Nixon ordered a stop to the investigation because he didn't want any more information to come out. And on December 23rd, in a meeting with Haldeman, I'll read from here, he says, frankly, by the end, it will reflect on us because in the end, we're still going to be accused that we fucked up something. Haldeman said, that's right. It's the whole story. It's like the Pentagon Papers. We didn't have anything to do with it, but in the end, hurts us some. So Nixon shut it down. They eventually had John Mitchell go to Thomas Moorer and say, we know what you did. We're going to keep it quiet, and basically thought that they had Moorer in their pocket for whatever they needed him to do. They took Radford, transferred him to a naval base in Oregon, didn't take away his security clearance, didn't do anything to him, even though he was ostensibly the guy they were blaming for everything. And then Haig went back to the Pentagon and had his friend J. Fred Bazart, who was the Pentagon counsel, conduct a separate investigation, totally different from the one done by the White House, in which they had Don Stewart, the Pentagon investigator, do a second interview of Welander. And since Stewart didn't know about the first interview, he couldn't use that as a guide. In the second interview, he presents Haig as a victim, not as a perpetrator of the spy ring. They eventually created a bogus report for the Pentagon consumption that covered up the spy ring even more. And at that point, by the end of January 1972, that was it. It kind of sat fallow for a few months until the Watergate break-in kind of led to people trying to explore more about this. And as the investigation in Watergate started to implicate people like John Ehrlichman, he wanted to use his work as a White House plumber as part of his defense. And the White House, then led by Alexander Haig, brought in by Nixon to be his second chief of staff, shut him down. And Haig brought, as I write about in my book, Haig's Coup, brought in the Pentagon counsel, J. Fred Bazart, to be the White House Watergate counsel. So he was now in the White House enabling parts of the Watergate defense and also the continued cover-up about the spy ring. And in fact, not long after Bazart came in to the White House, he had a meeting with the president. And Nixon says to him, I'm sure you're aware of the Indian Pakistan story. And Bazart replies, I wrote the report on that, Mr. President. And Nixon goes, about the yeoman? Yes, sir, the yeoman, the admiral. The taking of Kissinger's file from his briefcase, Bazart said. Mr. President, not too many people know about that, and I'm very afraid it's going to come out. If it comes out, you know who it's going to hurt, Nixon said. It's going to kill the chairman, meaning Moorer. I'm aware of it, Bazart answered. Nixon fulminated about Radford. That goddamn yeoman, he knew too much, adding that they had to let him go. And then Bazart reveals that Melvin Laird, the defense secretary at the time, knew all about it and was an active participant in the Pentagon cover-up of that as well. This bubbled along until late 1973, in which a group of reporters, two reporters specifically, Jim Squires of the Chicago Tribune Dan Thomason of Scripps Howard newspapers began to delve more deeply into all of this. Their first story came out on January 11th, 1974, that said, there was a spy ring. It was followed the next day by stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The Times story by Seymour Hersh was far more accurate than the Post story written by none other than Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And as I lay out in both of my books, Woodward and Al Haig had a close relationship that started when Woodward was a briefer for the Joint Chiefs and would visit Haig routinely at the National Security Council. Something that Woodward has denied, but it was backed up by Laird and two other people, including Moorer, who worked at the Pentagon and the NSC. So they had a relationship, and Haig used that to help cover up his involvement in the military spy ring in Woodward's stories. And at the time, remember, Woodward was writing stories about his former bosses, Admirals Wellender and Moorer, and never disclosed that to his readers. And it's only now when you realize that, you see the depth of his deception in his own reporting. And people were not the wiser. They didn't know anything. And many of them weren't matching the Times stories with the Post stories to see what happened. And that helped further the cover-up. There was an investigation by the Senate Armed Services Committee in which all of the principals, except for Radford, lied about what they knew and the importance of all of this. And it was quite important. As Nixon noted, it would have blown the lid off the Joint Chiefs and the Pentagon. Finally, one other discovery that I made related to this for my books comes from another spy ring, apart from this one, that was engineered by Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who was then the chief of naval operations. He helped plant a staffer in Kissinger's staff, a Navy lieutenant named David Halperin, did so with Haig's assistance. And Halperin became the note taker on some of the most critical meetings Kissinger had on the intro to China, including the secret meeting he had in Palm Springs, California with Nixon's ambassador to Pakistan, Joseph Farland, in which Kissinger said, I'm going to go on this trip to Pakistan. I'm going to pretend to get sick. I'm going to get whisked away to Beijing for secret meetings, and no one will be the wiser. Well, the note taker for that meeting, David Halperin, was piping all this information to Zumwalt, who was then giving it to Moorer. And they were telling Yeoman Radford to find out more about what Kissinger was doing on China. This is all detailed in a 1991 oral history that Zumwalt gave with some Pentagon historians. Was kept classified for at least 2 decades. And in that interview, Zumwalt clearly says Halperin was his source. And interestingly enough, in records kept at the Vietnam Center at Texas Tech University, there's a variety of correspondence between Halperin and Zumwalt, who was Halperin's mentor, in which they make fun of Kissinger and his gullibility, including this letter from November 1993, in which Halperin wrote, I ran into Henry Kissinger coming back from a cocktail party last Thursday evening. We had a vaguely pleasant chat, during which he remarked, you're one of the assistants Zumwalt inflicted on me, but you're the only one who has remained loyal. The paranoia obviously has not diminished, Halperin concluded. Well, in the case of Halperin and Zumwalt, it seems that Kissinger's paranoia was completely justified. And this whole episode about the military spy ring just shows, all of the variety of elements of secrecy involved with Nixon, that go back to the 1968 campaign and his interference in the Paris peace talks, which I know that Shane has written about in his book, which was, evident now, I think, to anybody. The secret bombing of Cambodia and all of the issues that Nixon was involved in. The Pentagon wanted to know what he was doing. He wasn't telling them. And this underlying cover-up of the Moorer-Radford spy ring influenced his conduct in the Watergate break-in and that of his closest aides, particularly Al Haig and J. Fred Buzzard. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ray. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. So, yeah, Ray will join us later for the discussion with the other panelists. So, Ray, you can either stop your video and mute yourself here, or go backstage until that point. Great. So, I'm going to go on from there by talking about James McCord, who I don't think we've touched on a little bit today, but we haven't gone into too much detail. So I'm going to start by showing a couple of videos just to give you a flavor of the man, and also how he got involved with the bugging of the Watergate, and also his interest in the VVAW. So initially, I'm just going to show you some of his Senate Watergate testimony, looking at how he actually bugged Spencer Oliver's phone, describing that particular process, which I think is a kind of fascinating clip.
This is essentially a radio transmitter, which is powered by the telephone line itself, for the purpose of transmitting those conversations over the phone.
When that transmitter is connected in the telephone, is it capable of picking up both sides of the conversation and broadcasting it to another place?
Yes, it is.
Could you just demonstrate how you would place that in that telephone that's before you?
The cover would be taken off of the telephone, and two of the wires connected with this would be interconnected in series with the wiring within the phone itself. And this is the antenna, which would be concealed underneath the telephone mechanism. The device itself would be likewise concealed under some portion of the telephone mechanism. There are 3 or 4 places that it could be put.
And is that the receiver, which in fact was used by Mr. Baldwin over at the Howard Johnson's hotel?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the first clip, just setting up James McCord as essentially being the wireman or the electronics expert on the break-in team. He wasn't an expert at breaking and entering, as Richard Helms rather dismissively observed during the testimony itself. But he planted bugs in Spencer Oliver's phone and in a phone in an adjoining room. He thought he was putting a bug on Larry O'Brien's phone, the DNC chairman, but actually he didn't know at the time where Larry O'Brien's office was, so put a bug on the wrong phone, and then that bug actually didn't work, which is part of the reason why they had to go in a second time. But also, apart from being a kind of a gun for hire in terms of going onto the team as an electronics expert who had an acquaintance with Liddy and obviously was the security chief for the committee to re-elect the president, he also had his own motivations, which he touched on in his Senate Watergate testimony, but then later discussed in a PowerPoint that he sent to members of his family in 2006, and which his niece sent me after his death. And I'm going to share with you kind of this evening or this afternoon, your time. So before I go to McCord's PowerPoint, I'm just going to share a little bit of the video from his Senate Watergate testimony about the VVAW and what his thinking was around them as a group at that time, and what their activities were and how he was monitoring them. And Scott Camil is his name definitely comes up in this testimony. It's about 3 minutes long.
The Vietnam Veterans Against the War was one such violence-oriented group that was already saying in the spring of 1972 that they were going to cause destruction to life and property at the August Republican Convention, using, in their own words, their own bodies and other weapons as the spearhead of the attack there. These are their exact words, and some of them have since been indicted in Tallahassee, Florida, with additional evidence of plans to cause damage to life and property at the convention. Later in the summer of 1972, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War did in fact have offices in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, as I understood. I had also received information from the Internal Security Division of the Department of Justice in May 1972 that some individuals in Florida planned to forge college press credentials to get into both the Democratic and the Republican convention sites and blow up the communication centers of both parties there and cause havoc on the convention floor. Now, we also had word from CRP sources alleging that the McGovern Committee had a quote pipeline directly into the offices of the committee to re-elect the president in Washington. And allegedly, they were feeding out on a regular basis policy position papers, that is, plans and strategy, which were rather important to the success of the candidate's campaign. I had no indication whatever that Larry O'Brien or that Senator McGovern had any knowledge of or any part in such. Just to the contrary, I was completely convinced they did not. But I was not so sure that without their knowledge, other staff members might not be working behind their backs to quietly encourage such groups as the VVAW. McGovern's early political base was with some of the radical groups. My questions were, what was the extent of such encouragement, if any, and how far did it go? Did they let such groups use their telephones and work in their offices? These were then some of my concerns in my role as a security chief at CRP. I felt that the Watergate operation might produce some leads answering some of these questions. And I've been advised that the operation had the sanction of the White House and the Attorney General while he was Attorney General. In hindsight, I do not believe that the operation should have been sanctioned or executed, nor should I have participated. However, you previously asked some of my motivations and what the atmosphere was at the time, and those are some of the things that make up that atmosphere and that motivation.
Okay, so you can see from that the VVAW and McCord's curiosity or investigation into them at that time was one of the drivers for him to, or an additional incentive, I suppose, for him to also go into the Watergate and accept the mission to go in to DNC headquarters. And that's also reflected in the PowerPoint that he gave to his family about his role in Watergate, which I'm now going to share with you. So let me just get it up on my screen. And I've edited a little. You can find a full copy on my book's website, nixondirtytricks.com. I've just edited it just for coherence, really. But this is how he framed it to his family in his later years, Watergate and the Gainesville 8 as being the key, one of the key hidden motivations of why he went in and was involved in the break-in team. Setting up the war in Vietnam as a major re-election issue at the time. Senator George McGovern became the Democratic candidate. He was the favorite candidate by the Nixon campaign. He was the candidate they wanted. They thought he would be easily beaten. And so there was an element of political intelligence in terms of monitoring the phones on Spencer Oliver's phone to find out Oliver was heading up the Stop McGovern campaign. So part of the bugging, I think, was to do with the political intelligence to kind of undermine the Stop McGovern campaign so that McGovern would win the nomination at the Democratic Convention in Miami and would be the easier of the candidates to beat. So he sets up former Attorney General John Mitchell, his resignation, and then leading the Nixon campaign again in '72 after leading the Nixon campaign to victory in '68. With Jeb Magruder as his deputy, as has been spoken about earlier. And McCord has always talked about the protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago as exactly what they wanted to avoid in 1972, both in terms of threats towards the Republican National Committee and CREEP, and also any potential violence or demonstrations at the Republican Convention, which had been switched from San Diego to Miami, fearing a large turnout of 250,000 people in San Diego. They felt Miami was a more secure venue for the convention. So a lot of his thoughts at the time in kind of May, June 1972 were not just about protests in Washington, where a couple of 100,000 people were turning out, but also, you know, what was to come in terms of security at the Republican convention in Miami. So Chicago 7 and the violence at the Democratic National Convention. I mean, obviously from Chicago 7, but also the police response from the Chicago Police Department. And then in September 1971, McCord himself joining the committee to re-elect as their director of security, initially part-time, but then he went full-time in January as the campaign began to really rev up. And his main mandates to prevent a reoccurrence at the GOP convention in Miami of the violence of '68 at the DNC Chicago convention, to provide overall security for the re-election committee, and to act on two FBI reports of major threats from the VVAW, potentially the assassination of US senators and congressmen and violence at the Miami convention, with the VVA leader Scott Camil, according to McCord, involved in both. So those threats reported by the FBI that came into McCord were of threats to potentially kill 3 US senators, including Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. And I think Scott will have something to say about that later. Senator John Tower of Texas and Senator John Stennis of Mississippi, who obviously had a key role later in Watergate in terms of the Stennis compromise arrangement around the tapes, which wasn't followed up. And him quoting Scott Camil and his group as saying their intention to drive the GOP convention in Miami into the ocean. So John Kerry back then was co-chairman of VVAW in 1971, resigning later in that year. And that had also been the year with the Winter Soldier investigation, in which Scott was a major part. And then this is McCord's notes on Scott Camil himself. So he took charge of the National VVAW in November 1971. Scott can kind of correct us on that. And then he was head of the Gainesville Aid Group, which was planning action at the 1972 convention in Miami. So the Gainesville Eight, as they were called, were the group that were targeted by McCord. And this is a quote from Scott, according to an FBI report at the time, in terms of what their plans were. So McCord goes into the background of Scott Camil, who'd served in the US Marines in Vietnam and then had come back from Vietnam and got involved with VVAW on their steering committee. And obviously the FBI were keeping close attention to them. And there were also allegations received that VVAW had a volunteer worker at the DNC headquarters in Washington, DC, who was encouraging violence at the August Miami convention. So these were some of McCord's concerns and some of why he felt that by gaining access to the DNC and looking at some of the documentation in there and also booking the phones, that might give him more information on this aspect of his inquiries, as well as what Liddy officially wanted him to do. So you'll see that his response after receiving these FBI reports was asking for all information about the threat to the GOP convention in Miami. He made a site visit to Miami just weeks before the Watergate break-in, just to plan security there during the convention. And it was around this point where he was asked by Liddy to get involved in the Watergate break-in itself. So obviously it kind of suited his plans to target the DNC in this way. So he agreed to participate in the Watergate break-in, according to McCord, both to search the premises for information about the VVAW volunteered, reported to be working at the DNC, and also to assist with the wiretapping, which he believed might provide evidence of a VVAW volunteer encouraging violence at the Miami convention. So Liddy and Hunt were the key players in terms of organizing the DNC break-ins. Excuse me. And then the Gainesville Eight were indicted for violence planned for the Miami GOP convention in July '72. So timeline very close to the Watergate break-in and arrests. And here are some pictures of VVAW demonstrations at that convention, blocking Collins Avenue in Miami and demanding a meeting with President Nixon. Then there was a trial of the Gainesville Eight, and the defense that they had weapons in order to defend themselves against attacks by the GOP resulted in their acquittal. And then the Watergate break-in trial itself, McCord observed that Jeb Magruder perjured himself with his testimony. His assistant did so also, and that resulted in McCord writing to Judge Sirica his famous letter, which later led to him working with prosecutors like Earl Silbert, and gradually Dean and Magruder also cutting a deal with prosecutors and beginning to reveal the links to the White House that led to the second Watergate trial, not of the burglars themselves, but of all the president's men and those in the White House. So in May 1973, the Senate Watergate hearings began, and Senator Sam Ervin wasn't particularly interested in the VVAW connection that McCord had discussed. He was mainly interested in the wiretapping of DNC headquarters. And 20 years later, McCord quotes an oral history interview that Scott gave to the University of Florida, again, about some of the plans, which I think Scott can clarify when he comes on in a few moments to discuss some of McCord's claims in this PowerPoint here. So the conclusion that McCord reaches is that the threat against the 1972 Republican convention in Miami was real. The Senate Watergate Committee was not interested in the threat and therefore kind of disavowed it or ignored it, but it was a key motivator for him to get involved. So I think me personally, having delved into McCord's story quite deeply, I'm a little bit skeptical about this belated PowerPoint from McCord. It's quite self-serving in terms of providing with a legitimate reason for the break-in. It obviously ties in with his stated testimony that he felt the break-in was on the orders of John Mitchell, former Attorney General, and so on, and you know, legitimate on the grounds of national security, which is obviously bolstered by this VVAW angle. But yeah, I think it was a fascinating opportunity today to bring in Scott Camil and get his overview on this and the links between Watergate and the Gainesville 8, and to describe really the atmosphere at that time of the VVAW, their plans for the convention, and McCord's interest in Camille and what he was doing at that time. So I think I'll stop sharing at this point and bring in Scott Camil. So I think he's listening backstage and he can hopefully join us. Scott, if you can just click on the webinar icon backstage, and then hopefully you'll come into the main room and join me. Great. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining us, Scott. Do you want to test your audio? Can you say something just to make sure we can hear you?
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. How do you hear this radio?
Very good. Okay, so great to be with you. So, I mean, I know it's quite strange maybe for me to present McCord's PowerPoint and then, you know, to kind of ask you to rebut it. But I mean, maybe give your perspective on that period and some of what I've talked about there in terms of your side of the story and what was happening and how it ties in with Watergate, how the Gainesville 8 and Watergate connections come together.
So the first thing I would say is that there's two separate things that are being mixed together here, and that is convention activity and the March on Washington. And it was during the convention activity, our plans, we were told by William Lemmer, who was one of our coordinators, that he had information that the authorities were going to shoot somebody at the convention. They were going to raise the drawbridges that connected Miami Beach to the mainland, and that they were going to take out the demonstrators. So when we received that information, we made contingency plans. If that really happened, what are we going to do to protect those people? So the plans for the convention were based on that information, which was fed to us by William Lemmer, who worked for the FBI. So you could say it might be a form of entrapment, if you will. They knew exactly what we would do if they presented us with that information. Our plans called for using the minimum amount of force necessary to protect our people.
Yeah.
The March on Washington was a little bit different. We felt, some of us felt, VVAW was not all agreed about many things. We all agreed that the war was wrong, but we didn't agree on why the war was wrong, for instance. So we had set up a week to go to Washington and to lobby with our senators and congressmen. I sent a letter to all of the congressmen and senators from Florida, told them what date we were coming, and I asked for appointments to see us. When I got there, it turned out we didn't have appointments, and I was really upset about that. And it turned out that the way that the mail was dealt with is the letters that I sent, since they were postmarked from Gainesville, even though they were sent to other Florida people, they were all sent to the Florida representative from Gainesville, which was Don Fuqua. So they never got that stuff. We wanted to, while we were there, we wanted to lobby them against the war in Vietnam. We were trying to stop the war in Vietnam. We felt that the government was lying about it. We had information, not that we read or studied about, but we actually were the people who carried out the US policy in Vietnam, and we wanted to bring that information forward. For the last, we decided, or part of the planning, was that for the last day, we would save the Hawks for the last day. And since they were not representing us, the majority of the population of the United States was against the war. But the people in Congress and the Senate, they didn't care. So we felt we'd go up there and do something about it. And so the last day, we were supposed to schedule for the last day the most right-wing, hardcore, pro-war representatives and senators and take them out. Each group, so I was responsible for Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And each, the US was broken down into 28 regions, and different coordinators were responsible for different congressmen and senators. So that's what the plan was. I can't hear you.
In terms of taking that out, what did that mean?
To kill them.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Take them out, kill them.
Right.
And let me say that I learned my conflict resolution skills in Vietnam.
Mm. Okay. And so talk to me more about Pablo Fernandez and his story. He was somebody who was working for the Miami police, I think, and he kind of entrapped you in Florida.
Yes, he was also working for the FBI, and he was also working for the CIA. When he was outside of the US, it was CIA work. When he was inside the US, it was FBI work, but Martinez was his handler for both inside and outside. And it's kind of gives you a clear view of how our government does this stuff. It's the same people doing it, but they just call themselves FBI if it's local or CIA if it's not local. So one of my jobs, because under the rules of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the regional coordinator is responsible for all activities that take place in their region. When the Democrats and Republicans decided to have the conventions in Miami, that was my region. So it became my responsibility for a ton of stuff. Part of that stuff was going down and meeting with the Miami Beach Police, Metro-Dade County Police, Dade County Public Safety. We played softball with the police. We got to know the police. And it was also to talk to right-wing organizations. So I set up a meeting with two organizations, Abdallah and Alpha 66. William Lemur, who was one of our members, and also turned out that he worked for the FBI, which I didn't know at the time, set up the meetings. And the meeting was with Pablo Fernandez. And so I went down to Miami with William Leamer to meet with Pablo. And I told Pablo that basically there was no reason for us to have antagonism towards each other because we were both fighting for the same thing. His group wanted self-determination and independence for the people of Cuba. Our group wanted self-determination and independence for the people of Vietnam. So we were both fighting for the same thing, and there was no reason for us to have any problems when we were down there. So that was the purpose of me meeting with Pablo. At the meeting, Pablo offered me automatic weapons, grenades, mortars, and those kind of things, which I had no use for, and I told him that. And Pablo was wearing a wire, as were other people who I met with. And during our trial, the government claimed that none of those wiretaps worked, even though Pablo and other undercover agents said that they listened to those tapes afterwards and those tapes worked. But because all of those tapes would prove that we weren't planning violence, they made those tapes unavailable. Years later, out of the blue, I got a phone call from Pablo. And he told me that he was dying of cancer, and that he had regrets for what he had done, and he was sorry, and he asked me for my forgiveness. And so I gave him my forgiveness. And in his last, in his end times, he and I became friends.
Well, I've actually, after we talked yesterday, I found a news clip from 1973 featuring Pablo Fernandez and talking about your story. So I'm just going to show it now. It's about 3 minutes, but I think it gives a flavor of what was happening back then in terms of some of the subterfuge. So I'm just going to share this video, and that'll give a flavor of what was happening.
The organization of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War had been heavily infiltrated in the past. Officials were not so worried about the hippies or the zippies or the yippies, but these were veterans, and many had the scars to prove it. They didn't do for sure what they would or could do, so the spies swarmed through their ranks. After the conventions, the veterans would count 11 different agencies, local police, and intelligence units as having infiltrated their ranks. Take this meeting, for example. In June of last year, the vets had asked for a series of meetings with the local police and other demonstrating groups to work out ground rules for the conventions. The undercover agents probably outnumbered the vets. There was Harrison Crenshaw, the black man on the left, and Gerald Rudolph, the man on the right. Both were full-time members of the Miami Public Safety Department, or the Sheriff's Office, posing as veterans against the war. Pablo Emmanuel Fernandez, posing as a representative of a militant Cuban group, actually a paid informer for the police. Juan Carlos Rodriguez, who accompanied Fernandez on at least one electronic bugging mission. At the end of May last year, Fernandez and Rodriguez came here to a Hialeah drugstore to meet with veteran leaders Scott Camil, Alton Foss, and Bill Leamer, a vet who turned out to be still another FBI informer. Fernandez was wearing a body bug supplied by the Miami police. Today, the police say the bug didn't work. The vets say Fernandez tried to set them up by offering to sell them machine guns, and they've told that story many times, but they cannot tell it now. The federal judge who is hearing the Gainesville conspiracy trial has imposed a gag rule. He says he'll hold in contempt of court any defendant, lawyer, or even witness who now tells his story to a newsman. At any rate, the vets have told the story many times before. They say Fernandez tried to set them up. Fernandez says he did not. Remarkably, Miami Police Intelligence Chief Adam Klimkowski admits guns were offered. In a direct quote to a Miami reporter, he said, "We were hoping for the overt act necessary to produce a charge of conspiracy." The vets claim that was only the tip of a massive bugging campaign against them. The government denies it. But at a pre-trial hearing here in the Pensacola courthouse, Pablo Fernandez admitted he secretly recorded at least one other phone conversation between him and VVAW leader Scott Camil. He wouldn't talk about it outside the courtroom, and for months the government wouldn't admit it inside the courtroom.
Okay, and yeah, I had to cut it short, but then Angelica Rohan, who you may remember, remembers hearing the tape, you know, so it's so I mean, I wonder, go ahead, sorry.
I think she said the spies were spying on the spies who were spying on the spies. And that was one of the really things that really helped us in the trial. Like, there were many meetings that I was at that I was the only person at the meeting who was not an undercover agent. And because the undercover agents the agencies didn't share information, they didn't know either. So at the trial, Agent B would say Scott Camil and Mr. B and C did something bad. And Mr. B was an agent. In his reports, he said Scott Camil, Mr. A, and Mr. C did something bad. And the same thing with Mr. C. So they just chopped each other up.
Yeah. And so what do you think the impact of Watergate happening around the same time, what effect, if any, did that have on the Gainesville 8 trial, do you think? In the way
Well, it was really interesting because the judge ordered that the jury was sequestered. So they were locked up in a hotel room. All their phone calls with anybody were monitored. Any visits where anybody was monitored, any mail or newspapers that they received had to be checked first. And the judge ordered nothing that made the U.S. look bad could go to the jury. So each day there were articles about Watergate, and the jury would get newspapers with all of those articles cut out because they weren't allowed to know about it. It was laughable. It was terrible, but it was laughable.
Okay, we have a question, Scott, from David Kaiser in the audience. He asked, why were your assassination plans on Capitol Hill not carried out in the end? What was the reason why you didn't go through with those?
So the discussion for the plans that I talked about, what we would do in Washington, were discussion about what we would do, and other people had other ideas about what to do, and my idea did not have enough votes to win.
Okay, yeah, because there was a meeting, was it in Kansas City, where some of these ideas were kind of discussed? I remember reading an FBI report about it. Okay, so your idea wasn't chosen, but it was reported to the FBI in some way, presumably.
Right, because there were so many FBI people there at the meetings.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, interesting. Is there any other, I mean, obviously you never met McCord. Were you ever aware of, you know, the interest of McCord, or aware of any VVAW activity in the Democratic campaign, as he alleges?
No, but let me say that VVAW members are American citizens, just like anybody else. So of course we were going to, many of us were registered to vote, and voting was really important, and we pushed voting. And of course it wasn't Nixon that we were asking people to vote for.
Yeah. And I mean, were VVAW as a group they're obviously a significant presence at the Republican convention. Would you say VVAW was kind of leading the protests, or which groups were kind of leading the planning for those protests in Miami Beach?
So what happened was the convention was supposed to start on a Monday. On that weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, they rounded us up. They rounded up 24 of us. And so we didn't get to go to the convention, the first convention, until the last day. And then for the second convention, they set up for the time of our arraignment. And so we had to go to Pensacola, so we didn't get to go to the second convention. And then they set up another arraignment on election day. So all of the people who didn't live in Pensacola or Florida lost out on the ability to vote.
No, I mean, it just calls to mind Liddy's original plan when the convention was due to happen in San Diego, to deport all the protesters to Mexico, you know, for the duration of the convention. So it's very much in line with thinking
that was the Houston plan, I believe.
Or kind of early gemstone planning, I think. Yeah. Okay, good. So I think at this point, because we have about 15 minutes left, I'm going to call the other panelist, Ray Lockard, to come back in to the main room with us. Sorry for my coughing. And please feel free to put your questions. Okay, David says thank you for answering. But if you have any other questions, please pop them in the chat. And Ray, if you can join us. Before Ray joins us, I just wanted to kind of expand on my thinking in terms of Ray's presentation and McCord's other potential hidden motivation. I'm very interested in a group called the American Security Council, who were a pressure group who opposed Nixon's moves towards détente with Russia and China at the time. They were very aware that Congress had cut Pentagon budgets for 3 years running. So they were on their board were 3 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including General Earl Wheeler and Lyman Lemnitzer. And in May '72, a Washington Post columnist wrote that the forces bent on defeating any agreement for a pause in the arms race are concentrated in the American Security Council, which is the top of a heap of the military-industrial complex. 3 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are on the letterhead as co-chairman of the council. So it's interesting to me that those around McCord, who he claimed were just friends at the time, so I'm thinking of Lee Pennington and Donald and Lucille Sweeney, had all had their roots in the American Security Council at some point. Pennington was the Washington bureau director for their newsletter, and certainly the ideology, and they share that kind of Cold War mentality on the danger to the country of Nixon's peace feelers and détente and economic resumption of economic trade with Russia and potentially China. And later Alfred Baldwin, before he died, worked on a memoir, which was later published without his authorization. But that was very much his take on McCord as well, that was another hidden motivation for his involvement. And that potentially, if McCord had left the tape on the door, and if he had asked Barker to switch off his walkie-talkie as a means of sabotaging the break-in, then perhaps this is another possible explanation for the political ideology behind unseating Nixon in this way, which kind of ties in, you know, tenuously, I admit, with Ray's presentation. So I'd like to get your reaction on that, Ray, in terms of basically how we can track Moorer-Radford forward into Watergate, into the early days of Watergate, and figures like McCord, as well as obviously Haig then having a leading role in terms of, Nixon leaving the White House.
Well, I think there were a bunch of people who were interested in what Nixon was doing, who didn't trust him. I think people in the Pentagon definitely felt that way. And for good reasons. I mean, they were running a war and they didn't know what the president was doing, and they didn't know until years later that Nixon told Kissinger to tell the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, we have no plans to win on the battlefield. I think the Pentagon would have been shocked to have learned that. So they knew something was going on and they didn't trust him. And there were people who advised Haig when he was chief of staff, a guy named Morris Liebman, who was a controlling partner of a law firm, Sidley and Austin in Chicago, who was the guy who advised Haig on picking Leon Jaworski to be the Watergate special prosecutor, and basically a whole bunch of other people. He was a hardcore Cold Warrior who was aligned with a group like that. He was also close to William Sullivan of the FBI, who was the intelligence chief whose name surfaces a lot during the Watergate investigation. So yeah, there were right-wing people who had problems with what Nixon was doing. I don't know if that was a particular motivator for McCord or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I think in a lot of ways, McCord wasn't always sure what he was doing there. And he probably shouldn't have been there, and maybe they wouldn't have gotten caught if he wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, obviously, it was a crucial mistake that, security chief of CREEP obviously was on the break-in team. That was just a cardinal error. It's ridiculous. And apparently the justification for it was that their budget was cut from $500,000 to $250,000. Therefore, they couldn't afford anybody else, which seems odd to say the least.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think McCord remains an enigma, but obviously he had a wide kind of brief at the time, which took in VVAW, and also a feeling that Nixon, was not to be trusted. So it's kind of interesting. And it's been interesting to hear Al Baldwin's take before he died as well. Okay, so let me just check if we have any Q&As from the chat. Yeah, Sean in the chat is just saying, Sean Howe, just Abdallah was the student group mentioned by McCord. So can you tell us a little bit more about Abdallah, Scott?
Tell you more about Abdallah?
Yeah.
Well, all I knew is that they were a right-wing Cuban organization, and we were concerned that if we went down there to demonstrate, their anti-communism might make them think that we were pro-communist and attack us. And we didn't want to be attacked. We didn't want to go down there to have a fight. So it was my job to go down there and meet with them. And Pablo was the person who I met with.
Yeah, wow.
I'd like to show.
Yeah, go ahead.
So at the Gainesville 8 trial, I just want to show the T-shirt that we wore.
And this was what, July 1972, so it was right after, wasn't it?
Our trial was, I think, in August of 73.
Oh, sorry, it was August 73. Sorry,
but we started getting arrested way before that.
Yeah. Okay. And funnily, yeah, I mean, you just reminded me that I forgot to mention about Pablo Fernandez, that he was actually part of the Cuban delegation, let's say, who were sent to Washington in early May after the death of J. Edgar Hoover to actually protect the rotunda from anti-war demonstrators. I don't know if you were there, Scott, but yeah, and there were fisticuffs apparently between Sturgis and I think Fernandez threw punches at some of the demonstrators apparently. So he was playing all sides, it seems, at the time. And it's really interesting to hear that Martinez was essentially his case officer in terms of whatever was going on at the time. You know, really, really interesting. So I'll come back to Ray maybe for the final question. Ray, what do you think is any other impact of Moorer-Radford on Watergate for you in terms of the break-in itself and the investigation that followed?
I don't think it really had anything to do with the break-in itself. In terms of the investigation afterwards, I mean, that was one of the things that Nixon was covering up. Actually, in his statement on May 22nd, 1973, that Haig and Buzzard helped engineer, he admitted as such, you know, I was protecting things that we were investigating that were, you know, major national security issues. And I know a lot of people were skeptical of that, but when you look back at it now, the idea that there was a serious breach between the military and the president was a national security issue. It was a pretty big deal. And that's not to defend how Nixon did business or what he was saying, but he believed it was serious. And I think, you know, in retrospect, you could see that it was a serious thing. And I believe that many of Haig's actions as Nixon's chief of staff were done not to help Nixon, but to help Haig. And covering up his involvement in the spy ring was at the top of that heap. I mean, you can say, well, why was it significant? Well, he knew that Nixon was obsessed with secrecy. And if he was the guy fingered at, you know, for breaking that secrecy, he'd probably get fired and there would go his career. He certainly never would have been Secretary of State. He wouldn't have been NATO commander. He wouldn't dared run for president. So the stakes for him were quite high. And I think he lied about it and got away with it.
Yeah. And I remember, you know, looking at Senator Howard Baker when he was doing his own investigation into CIA involvement potentially in the break-in. That's the one area where he realized there was a national security justification to hush it up, that it was so serious a breach that, you know, he shouldn't include it in his report because it was radioactive, you know, in that sense.
And he talked to Don Stewart about that. Baker did. You know, while he was doing the Watergate investigation and later. So those people knew about it. Irvin knew about it. And they were told that it was, you know, something that they shouldn't go into. And, you know, I think obviously it should have gone into, but the whole military establishment did whatever it could to cloak their involvement in that and make it seem like it was something that wasn't serious when it was, you know, very serious.
Yeah. Scott, you were going to come in on something?
Yeah, I wanted to just add one thing. So I think that Watergate is what helped bring Nixon down and caused him to resign. And if VVAW activity is part of what caused Watergate, then good for us. You're muted. You're muted.
That's my pet peeve. I'm just going to say it's been a fascinating discussion and great to finally meet you, Scott, and you too, Ray, after reading your books.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. So yeah, I hope in the audience you've enjoyed this and enjoy the day, and do join us again tomorrow where we've another packed 4 panels. I just wanted to point out that I'm working on my own Watergate series, a series of documentaries, one of which is now available for you to view. So I've posted the link. It's a 40-minute Watergate documentary just about the break-in, and I think you'll enjoy it. So I've posted it on the conference website, so watergate50.com. So if you haven't had too much Watergate and you still want to wallow in Watergate today or later, I'll have it up there for about a week, just to make it available for people to have a look at. So please feel free to look at that there. So thanks again to Ray and Scott, and thanks for everybody for coming, and we'll see you hopefully tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.